Today's occurrence happens in caves all over America, and with all of them, they started out dry, but didn't stay that way. In each of these stories, the groups of people made similar and different mistakes. In some, they get lucky, and in others, they don't. I'm Tatiana Bunch, and these are the stories of people who ventured into caves that flooded. On March 27th, 4 friends went on a trip to Indian Creek Caverns in Branson, Missouri. It was a Sunday morning in 1977, and 20-year-olds Doug Beckerdite, Gary Blades, Ed Brown, and 18-year-old Wayne Smith were excited to explore the cave. They were less than an hour's drive south of Springfield, Missouri. All 4 guys were expected to be home that evening, but when they didn't show, the Stone County Sheriff's Office was contacted. When officers made it to the cave site, they saw a pickup truck that had a note inside with the phone number of Ed's father. Assuming the missing men may be nearby, the police searched the area around the cave. When they couldn't locate any sign of them above ground, they had no choice but to assume the boys were still in the cave. Around 5 p.m. on Monday evening, an experienced caver and former advisor was called. It had been raining heavily since Saturday night until around this time on Monday, totaling 7 inches of rain. The experienced caver quickly put together a team of rescuers, including an emergency technician. The rescue group split into 2 parties, with the first going into the cave at 8 a.m. on Tuesday. They looked through the dry upper levels of the cave, while the second part of the group waited for wetsuits to arrive so that they could search the stream level of the cave. Pretty quickly after entering, the first group ran into chest-deep water with 6 inches of airspace, so they split up again. 3 people in the first group turned back at the water, and 3 continued to swim on to search. The water level was 5 feet above normal, but the rescuers were hoping that the 4 missing men were waiting out the flood on the upper dry levels. But after only making it 390 feet from the entrance, at 9 a.m., the remains of 4 cavers were found. They were lying together a little in front of the area where the upper level began, in 2.5 feet of water. The wetsuits arrived on scene not too long after, so the fallen cavers were able to be taken out of the cave before 11:30 a.m. Their cause of death was ruled drowning, but how they were found left many people baffled. The 4 cavers were found pretty much in a line, with the person in front wearing an electric headlamp around his neck, with the light on his chest still glowing. The caver in front also had a flashlight in one hand, and with the other, he was holding a pair of glasses by their bridge with the 2 earpieces unfolded. The second, third, and fourth person behind him were clutching the sides at chest level of the person in front of them. So like the guy in front has his glasses in one hand and a flashlight in the other, he's not holding on to anyone, but the second person is holding on to him. And the third person is holding on to the second person, and the fourth person is grabbing the third person. And they're all facing back into the cave, like they were trying to go to the upper levels. One theory was that the cavers tried to leave Sunday evening, but the cave was too flooded, so they turned around and went to the upper levels. They tried to leave Monday morning, but still couldn't, and turned back again, but they gave in to hypothermia. But then the question became, if they drowned due to water in their lungs, why were they joined and grabbing at each other like they were following the guy in front in a desperate attempt to flee? Like if they were following each other and someone went down, or even if they all went down, it just doesn't really add up for them to keep holding on to each other in an organized way until rigor mortis kept them like that. If you're drowning, most people don't really do that calmly. You're supposed to remain calm, but usually you flail, you fight, you might pull down someone trying to breathe yourself, but it's not likely that you bear hug in a line while you're drowning. So it's believed hypothermia played a big part, but then it would have looked like everyone already cold from getting wet when they went back to the cave entrance and it was flooded. They huddled for hours, growing colder and colder, to the point where maybe the guy in front was the only one with the strength to try and get everyone else out. They changed the light on Monday before leaving, again, because it wouldn't have been burning when they were found if they hadn't. They latched onto each other in a line and made their way through the deep water, but the entrance was still blocked. The leader was the only one with lights, so they would have had to turn around to go back with him in front. But at that point, it's hypothesized that they were all too weak and the caver in front collapsed. Since he was the one kind of pulling everyone else along, they all just fell with him, still in that position, and lied there breathing in water, which would mean they all died at the same time, which seems highly unlikely, but the only other few things I can think of is that they were just knocked off their feet if a rush of water hit them from behind while they were turning around, and they were so desperate to help each other or themselves that they just never let go. I mean, it's possible the guy in front maybe dropped his glasses and reached down to get them, and everyone fell after that, or they could have just been trying to pull him up. I don't know, they never figured out what could have caused this, so you tell me what you think happened with that one. But I will note that while everyone in the group was inexperienced, the cavers weren't considered irresponsible, because the cave apparently only floods under very extraordinary circumstances. Like, the rescuers themselves were shocked that they had to swim through the cave because they had never seen it look like that before. On Friday, April 22nd, a team of 10 cavers were camped near Precinct 11 Cave in Rockcastle County, Kentucky. It had been lightly raining and more rain was predicted, so at camp that evening, the group discussed the chances of flooding. Some members of the group were more experienced, and they felt like they knew the cave more than well enough to know that it would be safe for them to go inside the next day, regardless of the rain. But 2 of the cavers weren't convinced, and decided that when everyone else went into Precinct 11, they would busy themselves doing something else. So around 11 a.m. the next morning, April 23rd, 1983, the 8 remaining cavers ventured inside of the cave. In this group, 6 of the cavers were experienced and members of a caving club, but 2 were beginners. They were all from Cincinnati, Ohio, and were planning to map more of the cave. Precinct 11 Cave was discovered in 1979. Its entrance is around 200 feet or 61 meters long, and at the time of this story, more than 4 miles of passage inside had been mapped, but more than that were known. At the entrance, there's always a narrow stream of water that overflows from the main stream inside of the cave. Under normal conditions, 100 feet of the entrance is near an underwater passage called a sump, where its lowest point is just under 3 feet high with only 4 inches of airspace. After that, the passages are bigger and higher leveled. Because of the stream at the entrance, there was a gauge to show the water level. At 21 inches, the passage is sumped. When the group entered the cave, the gauge was at 18 inches. Since everyone made it inside, they all changed into the dry clothes they brought with them in plastic bags, with 2 people in the group having wetsuit tops. This was a requirement to go into this cave because you would get wet entering in. Then the group of 8 split up into smaller groups to complete the different tasks that they had planned. That's pretty much how they spent the whole day, mapping the cave. By 5 p.m., they had regrouped and were planning to exit the cave. They made it to the main river passage and realized the water had risen 2 inches, with water falling in one area quadrupled what it usually was. They quickly made their way to the entrance, hoping to get there before it was completely underwater, but the closer they got to the entrance, the more obvious it was that the water flow was up. They were walking through water up to their knees. They needed to leave though, so they pushed through and made it to a section that was completely sumped. They were too late. At that point, they realized they couldn't get out, so they retreated into the cave. On Sunday morning, the 2 cavers in the group who chose not to go in the cave were worried because there had still been no sign of the other 8. They went to the entrance of Precinct 11 and saw the gauge by the entrance was showing the water was twice its normal depth. Around 2:50 p.m., the 2 decided to call for help after still not seeing any sign of their friends. The Kentucky Cave and Rock Rescue Team was alerted, and several cavers and divers were contacted. State police weren't notified until 5 p.m. The rescue teams made it to the scene around 8:30 p.m. on Sunday, and upon realizing the situation, they called the National Cave Rescue Commission to request more divers. The rescue squad divers that they had on site weren't trained to cave dive, so they weren't fit for the situation and weren't used. Right around this time, the local media caught wind of the fact that 8 people were trapped in a flooded cave. It was also revealed who was inside. There were co-leaders, 45-year-olds, Gary Bush and Jack Hissong, 30-year-old Jacquees Ramsey, 28-year-old Mark Rocklin, John Wisher in his late 20s, and 26-year-old Mary Gratch. They weren't sure who the other 2 people in the group were because they weren't known members of the caving club. But they did know that it was a man and a woman from the 2 people who decided not to go into the cave. By 4 a.m. on Monday, a diver named George Venny made it to Precinct 11 and an hour and a half later made a recon dive. He was using standard gear and had a pack with an ammo box containing food, hot packs, and a stove. While inside, George made it to a completely submerged section, 100 feet long, that he had to crawl partway through. He couldn't see further than 1.5 feet in front of him. After that, he was able to mostly walk until his total distance traveled was around 700 feet. Then he dove through 2 more submerged tunnels before reaching a 4th. At this point, George turned around. When he made it back to the first sump, he saw a side passage that also looked like it was another submerged passage. George tied his guideline and left the cave at 11:30 a.m. With George not seeing any sign of the cavers and leaving the cave without much news to share, the news coverage of this rescue increased. When George left the cave, he made a statement saying it was possible he went down the wrong passage since he wasn't familiar with the area, but he searched 1,800 feet of the cave. Now, while George was in the cave, rescuers had requested pumps, and 2 coal mining companies were able to supply about 5 of them. 4 pumps and crew to run them showed up at the same time that George started his dive and were put into operation at 9:30 a.m. The 5th made it on site about an hour later. The pumps were able to move 500 gallons per minute and ended up lowering the water level by several inches, but the entrance was still underwater. At 3:30 p.m., more cave divers made it on scene and they were put up to speed. It wasn't until that point that another dive could even happen, because when George was leaving the cave from his dive earlier, the sound of the pumps scared him, so he dropped his guide reel and they had to wait for another reel to dive again. A little before 5 p.m., 2 divers entered the cave and followed George's line. They found a note left by the trapped cavers that said they were all alive. The 2 divers took the note with them when they left, and then at 7:30 p.m., 2 more people entered Precinct 11 with supplies for the trapped group. Divers also went in to get George's gear that he left. At 10 p.m., 2 people took the group warm clothes and sleeping bags and told them to expect to be brought out around 1 p.m. on Tuesday. About an hour prior to that, a 2,500 gallon per minute pump was installed and it helped to lower the water level, but there were some complications. Carbon monoxide levels from the pump exhausts were high around the cave entrance, and this kept divers from being able to work on the hoses for longer than 10 minutes at a time. The last dive done on Monday happened at 10 p.m., and it revealed that exhaust fumes were actually going into the cave, so some of the mine company employees built a canvas curtain around the pumps. Then the fire department set up fans to keep air near the entrance. At 5 a.m. on Tuesday, another 2,500 gallon per minute pump was installed. 4 hours later, the water level seemed like it was low enough to get the trapped cavers, and with one of the pumps looking like it was about to give out, they decided to go in and get them. They brought the group out in 2 groups of 4, with the first half of them exiting at 11 a.m. with one of the divers. The other divers stayed with the second group that exited about an hour later. Once both groups were out, the pumps were shut off, and within 15 minutes of the pumps being turned off, the cave was completely submerged again. The group was asked what happened while they were in the cave, and they started by telling how when they tried to leave originally, the water was knee-deep, and when they decided to retreat back into the cave, the water was up to their waist. They headed toward the mezzanine, a section that overlooks the river in Precinct 11, but before they climbed 20 feet up to the mezzanine, someone left a cairn by the river to monitor the water level. They checked it every hour and marked the height of the water. They chose to go to that overlook because it was above the river so they could keep an eye on it, but also because they knew there were emergency supplies stored there, and the flood hadn't made it to the soft dirt nearby yet. While waiting, everyone wrung the water out of their clothes, and anyone wearing cotton overalls hung those up to dry. The overalls never dried. For the most part, everyone's body heat dried the rest of their clothes over the next day, and 2 cavers who were wearing wetsuits decided to stay in those. Most people left on their wet boots, which gave them trench foot, along with any body parts that remained wet. They would end up suffering from the feeling of burning for months after that. Now, the experienced people in the group expected the drizzle outside to stop soon after they settled in and believed the water would go down within the next 24 hours. And everyone knew that they had 2 people waiting outside that would raise the alarm once they missed their planned exit time. Within the first few hours trapped there, the group looked through the emergency cache and made note of everything they had and discussed how they would use and ration what was inside. They spent the first night in the cave wrapped in garbage bags and burning candles to fight the 55-degree Fahrenheit or 13 Celsius temperature. After a while, though, they had to put out the candles because they were burning holes into their garbage bags while everyone slept, which I'm sure was miserable since they were still wet at this point. But they ended up spooning to make up for the lack of heat from the candles. Everyone rotated through to take turns being on the 2 ends of the group spoon, and the ground was so hard that they would all roll over at the same time every 30 minutes. If anyone started getting too cold, there was a large upper area nearby that they could walk around to keep moving, and 6 of the 8 cavers had carbide lamps that they could use to keep warm. They tried to find alternate exits too, but they didn't feel any air moving in the areas they were able to move to, so they were stuck. Now, it turns out George the diver wasn't using his own gear to do the dive. His equipment was at another cave in Kentucky waiting for him to do a trip there, so he borrowed the equipment he used. And because he wasn't able to see well, he took a wrong turn at the main intersection in Precinct 11. George went downstream. He spent 6 hours searching the wrong area of the cave and then trying to find a way out of the water. But because he left a water-resistant box of food on the dry bank near the main intersection, the cavers had food to grab when they ventured to that part of the cave on Monday. They went up that way to see if they could get out. When they realized they couldn't, they heard the pumps and saw a box of food and decided to leave a note that said, quote, "Help. 8 cavers waiting 1,800 feet upstream from here. Leave diving tanks here, only needed for the entrance. Been here since 11 a.m., Saturday, 4:23, now Monday, 4:25, 12 o'clock noon." End quote. They left the box the food was in case rescuers needed it. Monday evening is when the cavers were met by the 2 divers doing another dive to check on them. It was at that point that the group was told that there were 300 people and 6 helicopters outside. The cavers felt bad about causing so much commotion, but they were grateful to be brought food, hot chocolate, and space blankets. While the group waited to be brought out, the drop in water level caused toxic exhaust fumes from the pumps to blow into the cave and nauseate 2 of them. They had to retreat further into the cave to get away. When the 2 divers and rescuers returned to escort them out in groups of 2, the first group and diver only had 1.25 inches of airspace to leave the entrance tunnel. They literally had their noses to the ceiling to leave. The pump that looked like it was going to give out actually did have a seal failure while everyone was inside. A local farmer happened to have a replacement part to get the pump going again, hence the scraping of noses on the ceiling. And by the time a second group of rescuers went in to meet the other half of the group and the diver that stayed with them after that, and then made their way out, the second group had 3 inches of airspace to leave the cave. And like I said before, the entrance was underwater again 15 minutes after the pumps were shut down, and it stayed like that for 3 weeks after. The 2 originally unknown cavers were Jeffrey Gardner and Jill Vetter, both in their 20s. They were all trapped for roughly 70 hours. One weekend in the fall of 1992, 2 guys planned to visit some caves. Chris Anderson and Jim Jones were in Kentucky visiting the Morgan's Cave area. It's less than a 2 hours drive from Louisville. They came across Morgan's Pit, and the opening of the pit was a sinkhole. It was filled with flood debris. At first, it looked completely blocked off, but after kicking at it a bit, most of the debris fell down the 60-foot entrance shaft. There was a stump there that Chris and Jim were able to tie rope around and pull it out. They were planning to go into the pit that day, but it was so late that they decided to wait until the next day. So on Sunday, they set up the pit to rappel down, and Jim went down first. Once he made it to the bottom, he let Chris know he was off the rope, and he mentioned that it was hot where he was at. Chris thought that sounded a little strange, but he figured they were wearing wetsuits, so it was probably because of that. When Chris started making his way down the rope, he started having a little trouble catching his breath. When he made it to the bottom, he was out of breath. But he also felt hot, so The guys put it up to just being a little overheated and drank some water. They took off their climbing gear and looked around. The bottom of the pit had several connecting domes and appeared very spacious. They could see flood debris all along the walls, but there wasn't flood water there now, so they decided to look around. Chris tried to light his carbide lamp, but he only got a small orange flame. He spent a little time trying to get it to light again, but he gave up and decided to use his electric backup lighting instead. He was going to let the other lamp generate for a little longer. From the bottom of the pit, there was a 10-foot crawl that they had to do before entering a large room. In the large room, there was a stream moving along the ground. And by the time they made it into the room, they were huffing and puffing and stumbling around. They decided to sit down and try and catch their breath, but they couldn't. After sitting there for a moment or two and struggling to breathe, they realized that the air must be bad, so they quickly made their way to the rope. At this point, Chris couldn't feel his hands, and his head was pounding so hard it felt like it was going to explode. And since they took off their vertical climbing gear, they had to put it back on. Chris and Jim were having such a hard time trying to think and trying to get the gear on that it felt almost impossible. Chris was having a hard time telling one ascender from another, which is a piece of gear they use on the rope to help them go up. They can't really go up without it. So he was so scattered that he was struggling with that, and then he tried to put his seat harness around his chest. Jim got on the rope first and started moving up, and Chris pulled it together enough to get on the rope to follow. Chris tied extra gear to the bottom of the rope so that there was more tension on it, which would make it easier going up, considering they weren't exactly rigged on the rope right or in the right headspace. And while that was helpful, he forgot to consider stretch, because since his weight was on the rope, with the extra gear on the floor, he had to physically pull the rope through his equipment every step. Trying to get up the rope was literally a life or death fight. About halfway up, Chris was so exhausted that he didn't know if he would be able to keep going. He still had 30 feet to go, and by that point Jim was at the top of the rope, but he couldn't get off because his foot ascender was jammed. Jim yelled for Chris to give him slack in the rope, so Chris reached down and tried to pull up some of the rope. But that didn't work because Chris himself was on the rope. But he wasn't going to go back down, so instead, he managed to pull it together and pull himself to the top of the rope. Both guys struggled for a bit to get off the rope, and it wasn't until they were completely off of the rope and out of the shaft and on the ground again that they were able to actually breathe in good air. They both made it out alive, but barely. So, what happened? In this case, it seems like there was a buildup of carbon dioxide in the pit. There are 3 types of gas that commonly build up in caves, but in this case, we know it was probably carbon dioxide because that easily forms in caves with a lot of flood debris. So while the water wasn't a direct threat in this case, the debris left behind was. They say the easiest test for bad air in caves is using a candle. A candle won't be able to burn in bad air, but a carbide lamp, like the one Chris tried to light, will burn in dangerously low oxygen levels. They aren't used as much today since they were mostly used for mining and caving decades ago, but they do have their purpose in caving and hunting circles, since they're a small open flame that reflects the flame's light off of the metal surface holding it. At the time, the suggestion was for anyone descending pits to have their ascending gear ready to go and to think about air quality before going into caves, and especially before taking gear off. It's believed that drought conditions caused the buildup of bad air in the pit because any flood that went through would have flushed the air in there. And with all of the flood debris on the wall, it's clear that the area usually floods. Bad air can happen in any closed-off, poorly ventilated place though, with different gases depending on the situation. So run your generators away from the house, don't turn on a gas oven to keep warm, open the window when painting, the things your parents should have told you. On Saturday, January 23rd, 1999, a group of 9 people entered Hurricane Ridge Cave in West Virginia. This group was planning to do a 6-hour photo trip. The entrance to Hurricane Ridge is a small sinkhole requiring anyone entering to vertically climb down the tight entrance into the cave. There's also an inflowing stream of water there. Everyone in the group was dressed for the occasion. They were wearing wetsuits and neoprene gloves and all of the standard gear that they should use. The first part of their trip went according to plan. They took pictures and worked their way from the water passages on the lower level to the upper level that was dry. In this group were Tom Mollabad, Kristen Maddock, Ed McCarthy, Dennis Melko, Phil Murray, Frank Abato, Jeff Bray, Yvonne Dromes, and Gary Vermillion. At some point, Jeff started feeling unwell and wanted to leave. Kristen decided to help Jeff get out safely, and the two made their way to the exit. After they climbed up and out of the entrance, around 2 p.m., they realized it started raining. Now, everyone was aware of the weather forecast that day. It said there would be rain in the area, but everyone figured they could just keep an eye on the stream in the cave. It would tell them if water was starting to accumulate inside, and they could get out long before it started flooding. The rain outside turned into a full-on downpour, and a few inches of rain fell over a 2-hour time period. The entrance quickly turned into a whirlpool when a flash flood formed around 3:30. When the 7 cavers still in the cave tried to leave 4 hours after entering, they couldn't. They retreated further into the cave where they found an upper level that was dry. It had supplies stored there for mapping trips, so they were able to use a sleeping pad and some candles. Some of the cavers in the group also had plastic bags and survival blankets, so they were able to create heat tents. They used their coveralls and wetsuits and the sleeping pad for insulation. The candles were used to help keep them warm, and to see. The group of 7 huddled close together in the tent and rotated through who would be on the outside, so everyone was able to keep relatively warm. They would check the stream level every couple of hours. After some time, the water got as high as it looked like it would get before starting to lower. The cavers tried to leave again, but the tight area they had to get through near the entrance was still underwater and impassable. All 7 cavers returned to their camp and had to ration the food that they had while they waited. 33 hours after entering the cave, they tried to leave again, but still couldn't leave. But near the entrance, they found 3 plastic bottles wrapped with bright flagging tape and military-grade glow sticks inside for visibility. Each bottle also had a message from rescuers inside and food. The messages told them to wait for rescuers to come get them and included the weather report and date and time in each message. The trapped cavers went back to their tent, happy to have more food and with the knowledge that people were waiting to help them. They were obviously still cold though. On Monday morning, 5 rescuers made it to the trapped cavers' camp with food and heat packs. At this point, they had been in the cave for 49 hours, so they had to spend some time warming up and gathering their strength before they could try to leave. The cavers left the cave 52 hours after entering and still had to push through a very strong waterfall falling through the entrance shaft. Now, everyone in this group was experienced, and when Jeff and Kristen left the cave and came back to realize it was flooded, they didn't immediately call for help. They wanted to wait and see if the water would go down first and kept watch until Sunday afternoon. They only did that because they knew everyone was properly dressed for wet conditions and had the necessary supplies on them, as well as already stored in the cave. When they did reach out to someone on Sunday, it was a local caver who had other cavers come to the site to help, but they couldn't do much with the entrance and its surrounding passages completely flooded. They knew the people inside should be all right, but they dropped down the bottles with the message to make sure they weren't wasting energy, very precious energy, trying to get out when they couldn't. They wanted them to be aware of everything happening on the surface. Like, yes, we know you're in there. We have help waiting for you. But they also wanted the group to save their energy so that they could leave without too much assistance, which would have complicated things further and probably meant that they would have had to have been hospitalized. Or worse. Yvonne would later admit that they should have known better, but people with their temperaments have a habit of taking unnecessary chances. And went as far as to say that the 2 people leading the trip that day were actually reluctant to do that because of the weather report. But apparently the weather outside didn't seem very threatening to them before they entered, and this thunderstorm that came on was sudden. And then a second thunderstorm happening later in the day caused the cave to flood a second time, which kept them from leaving. The cavers believed their experience in the cave previously indicated that it took 4 hours for the stream inside to get high enough to cause a problem. Like they thought they had 4 hours at least, and in that time they would have had ample warning that the cave was flooding, based on the stream, which clearly wasn't the case. And now with 2 of these stories, the cavers were experienced, and because they saw that it would rain and they still decided to take a chance. Yes, they were lucky in the fact that they were in a cave that had space to escape to, but had they been in a cave where that wasn't a possibility, the endings would have been different. Although they probably wouldn't have gone into a cave where they wouldn't have had room to escape if they knew it would rain. But again, they did go into a cave knowing it would rain. So who knows? With both stories of experienced cavers, both groups also had proper clothing to be able to withstand the flood and decent enough supplies too. But had they been dressed differently, or had there not been additional supplies in the cave, again, the ending might have been different. As it was, some of the cavers from Precinct 11 were suffering for months with burning because they sat wet and cold for days. And let's not forget the time and resources spent putting together rescue operations and pulling them off. And if there hadn't been people on the outside aware that they were in the cave to be able to get them help and extra food, the possibilities are endless. So I think the lesson here is don't go into a cave when it's going to rain, or even if it has recently rained, because flooding can happen then too. Not even if it's somewhere that doesn't usually flood, experienced or not. Stay safe, and I'll be back Thursday. Sources can be found at occurrencepod.com, which is linked in the show notes, along with any other relevant information.